This is Suzanne Wagner of the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles. In the next hour, you will be viewing a conversation filmed in London of Sir Lawrence Vanderpost speaking to me of his close friendship with C.G. Jung. Lawrence Vanderpost is a man of many accomplishments. He's recognized throughout the Western world as a distinguished author and statesman. Perhaps he is most well known for his successful efforts to preserve the life and the culture of the Bushmen of the Kalahari. Vanderpost was born in 1906 in South Africa to a large and distinguished family. At the age of 20, he left South Africa to pursue a career as a journalist in London. During World War II and in the years after, Vanderpost served as a special envoy for Britain in the Far East and in Africa. In 1981, he was knighted for his many years of public services to the Queen. In this conversation, we hear how Vanderpost came to know C.G. Jung of Switzerland. He speaks of the value of Jung's discoveries for the evolution of the modern world. Before this, Vanderpost had expressed his appreciation for Jung and his psychology in two very extensive works. One, a feature-length film on Jung's life, which Vanderpost wrote and produced for the BBC, and the other, a poetic and candid biography of Jung published in 1975. This conversation took place in the winter of 1978 in the living room of Sir Lawrence's home in Chelsea, where he lives with his wife, Ingeret Giffard, a noted Jungian analyst of London. I would like to hear the story of how you met C.G. Jung in the first place.
Well, it's a very simple and yet a very complicated story, because the odds against my meeting him would have seemed insuperable, because whenever people had spoken to me about him in the past, although I think I have a natural interest in what is called the field of psychology, because of Freud, and my experience of Freud, and Jung's association with Freud, I completely rejected Jung, and I wasn't really interested. Then I came back from about 11, 12 years of continuous war, and I was still technically in the British Army, and I just dropped my uniform in London, and I went to Zurich, where my wife happened to be working at the time with Freddie Meyer and Tony Wolff in particular, and to a certain extent with Emma and C.G. Jung. And then they had one of these sort of parties they had for the Institute, and I was asked to come along, and I found myself put next to Jung. And that's how I met him. And then he happened to be at that moment talking to some eminent Dutch scholar, and they were talking about fire and the meaning of fire. And this Dutch scholar said, oh, well, of course, it's just energy, isn't it, fire? I've never forgotten the look on Jung's face, you know, because that anybody could just think of fire as energy. It was so remote. Of course, it's that as well. And I started to join in there, and I told them about how, when I'd been dropped into the jungles of Malaya, I discovered a very interesting primitive tribe called the Sakai, who made fire in a completely different way. And Jung was immediately interested. He said, how do they make it? And I said, well, it's very wet, it's always raining, so the Sakai, who go about naked, they carry a little belt, leather belt, and at the end of this they have a block of wood in in the center of which is a very deep cylinder, and the top of it is a kind of lid which has a rod attached to it, which fits exactly into the cylinder. And at the end of the rod, there's a very deep niche carved. And they have a little leather pouch full of dry moss, and they put the moss into the niche, and they put the cylinder into at least they put the rod into the opening of the cylinder, and then they knock the two together. And then they pull it out, and the moss is on fire. And I said to Jung that when I saw this, I had a man who was an engineer with me, and he turned to me and he said, "My God, Colonel, the diesel engine." And that was too much for Jung. And I heard him laugh. He roared with laughter, you know. The primitive people already, out of the collective unconscious, had the diesel engine principle working, you know. And I think it was that laugh of his which got me. And then we started talking immediately. It's a most extraordinary laugh that Jung had, you know. Because I remember Olga Fröber-Kaptein, who founded Eranos on the lakes of Ascona, told me that very often when Jung was talking there, and they sat round, they had a great round table at Eranos, where I've sat myself when I lectured there. And just above the table, you had the main road from Italy to Switzerland, and masses of cars going by. And Jung would sit there after a lecture, and they would have wine, and he would laugh. And Olga said it was amazing the numbers of time. Strangers would come down from the road, stop their cars, and say, "Would you mind showing us who that was who laughed just now?" His laugh had that kind of primordial quality of laughter. It was a laugh almost more of somebody who had been infected by the gods than, you know, it was really quite infectious. Well, that got me, and we started talking, and I went home with him afterwards, and to Mrs. Jung's despair, we sat talking until about 3 o'clock in the morning without break. And again, I had this very strange feeling, although it was snowing outside, it was bitterly cold, that I was sitting around one of the first fires in a camp somewhere in the bush in Africa, talking, as you can only talk in those conditions. And from that moment on, we became friends, and you know, we had a friendship which lasted all his life, and as far as I'm concerned, is still going on.
That's a wonderful beginning.
It's nice to think that it started with laughter and fire.
And fire.
Because particularly the fire, well, because obviously it's so much a symbol of consciousness, and all our cultures, all our civilizations begin with the discovery of fire. Every civilization you go to, Stone Age or House, somehow the first thing they tell you is how man found fire, how he discovered fire. And it's very odd that fire and laughter should have been these things. But what I so dislike about people's attitude to Jung is that they forget the laughter, which was so very much an important part of his life, which was very important to him. He had the most amazing sense of humor. I've never known anybody who made me laugh more. He had this tremendous human, almost animal warmth and immediacy. It was the immediacy of the laugh that got one. It was the laugh of a spirit which has been made immediate.
In the pictures that I've seen of him in his later years, there is a quality of earth and spirit that is uncanny. But he was such an earthy man. I mean, a scholar, yes, but there was this earth always. And it came through more and more for me the older he grew.
I think that's
Did you feel that?
Oh, I think that's tremendously true, because in a way, nobody has ever quite transcended the human paradox as Jung has done. And it's particularly remarkable for a man, because we men tend to fly off, you know, to leave the earth, to go off and follow an idea about. I mean, look at the history of Europe. It's a civilization which takes ideas so seriously that they will kill somebody else because they haven't got the same idea. We usually need the woman to bring us back to this great Mother Earth of ours. But Jung, in a sense, he did a sort of Dante-esque thing. He went into the earth, like a tree putting down his roots. Before he went up, I mean, that's what the confrontation with the collective unconscious meant. That very famous day when he sat at his desk and he said, well, Jung, there's nothing for it, here we go. And he let himself drop with his whole spirit. He went down into the earth. And I think this is frightfully important because just as Dante found that the way to heaven was by going down to hell first, Jung also found that the height to which the human spirit can aspire depends, in a sense, to the depth to which he can go, to which his roots can go down into the earth. So I think you're on to something tremendously important. And this became very, very obvious towards his end. I saw him just a few weeks before he died at Bollingen. And it was to me most moving. I should have really known that he was nearer his death than I knew he was. But he was so full of laughter and fun, and one didn't suspect it. But I should have known it from the fact that he was so close to nature, he'd drawn so close to nature, and he had discovered an extraordinary kind of kinship with the clouds, with the wind, with the trees. He always loved trees. I mean, I remember him saying to me that the trees for him were the thoughts of God, and that when he looked at the tree, it's almost as if he was in at the act of creation, which had a great, as time went on, as far as Jung and myself was concerned, had a great symbolic significance for me, because I think one of the essences of Jung's achievement was this realization that all creation is growth. There's no quick shortcut to creation. There's no, in a sense, the magic of it is in the growth, and that the growth is a process which is not an egotistical process. The ego may be the grit around which the individual awareness expands like a pearl in the oyster. The first thing he did when he went to Bollingen was to plant trees. I've seen photographs he showed me of Bollingen when he first chose it. There were hardly any trees at all. Now the place is waving with trees all around it that he planted, you see. And he loved animals too. They represented another stage on the creation for him. The tree was the thought of creation. The animal was already creation in action. The animal for him was almost a natural priest of God, because he said an animal did not fulfill its own will. It fulfilled the will of the life that was in it. In other words, it fulfilled the will of God. So he watched it with this thing he never lost, this amazing sense of wonder he had, always watching the animal with a sense of wonder. And he was like an artist. He had a very strong feeling of the artist about him. Whereas, a painter, well, for a painter, there's nothing that's unpaintable. There's a mystery in everything. For the poet, too, for the musician, no sound is nothing but a sound. It's something more. It conveys a plus. And this sense of a plus in everything was very highly developed in Jung. And this is very, very dynamic in Jung's whole thinking, and which is very important to our time, particularly to religion. Because when Jung was born, the whole of the religious experience of Europe, or not experience rather, but religious thinking, was imprisoned in the feeling that creation was something which was accomplished way back, and we were merely living it. But on the contrary, for Jung, the act of creation has barely begun, and that we, if we fulfill ourselves, if we, at the extent to which we achieve what he called wholeness, we have the privilege, not an easy privilege, but we have the privilege of participating in what is a continuing act of creation. And this feeling that he had, that if man lived his life religiously, if he lived his life symbolically, then it was almost as if what the theologians called God, and my Zulus called Nkulunkulu, the first spirit, where the first spirit had passed over some of his power and some of his responsibilities to the human being, and that the human being had a God-like task to perform in creation, and the extent to which he performed it, he derived his meaning. It's a very important part of Jung's thinking. And in that way, one comes to what, to me, is the most important thing about Jung, is that he's the most important religious personality the world's had for many, many generations. I wouldn't like, one doesn't want to go into comparisons, but through Jung, I think the human being who in all cultures, it doesn't matter which culture you take now, whether it's a Hindu, a Taoist, a Buddhist, a mumbo-jumbo, a praying mantis culture, it doesn't matter what culture you take, people have lost their capacity for religious experience because there isn't a contemporary door, as it were. And it seems to me that Jung has opened the door whereby the human being can recover again his capacity for religious experience. And in the extent to which man recovers this capacity for religious experience, the future of life on this planet depends.
Yes. Do you have any idea or do you have any feelings yourself about the fact that he sprang from Swiss soil, that this is where such an important development occurred
I think
for all of us?
I think his Swissness has an enormous amount to do with it. I think he was very much a Swiss phenomenon. But I go to Switzerland a great deal, and the Swiss are very lucky in the fact that their mountains that they have round them, this great natural phenomenon, keeps them in touch with their natural selves. It has a sort of physical, presents them with a physical mirror wherein they can recognize their own hidden world, the world wherein, as Manley Hopkins talked, and he said, oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful sheer, no man fathom. But also through a strange fact of history, the Swiss are almost the navel of Europe. It's almost, that's where the umbilical cord with the past was cut. And that to this day, it seemed to me that the Swiss spiritual, psychological lines of communication with our Roman and other forms of past, even our primitive past, are the least cut, the least frayed, that they are naturally in touch, and that they naturally tend to see life and the world as a whole. Even their view of history, as non-participants in history, tends to see it not in national terms, but to see it as a whole. And Jung, who was a tremendous lover of history, particularly the history which comes out of the Holy Roman Empire, the moment when the Christian West, which had a common language in Latin, was disintegrating and had to renew itself and failed to respond to that challenge. Jung had was enormously interested by this act of disintegration in Europe. And he was tremendously interested in the history of that period. That's why he felt so close to Erasmus, who was, as you know, who, although he wasn't a Protestant himself and was a Roman Catholic to the end, but was nonetheless one of the inspirational forces in the Reformation that came about. And through Erasmus, with Thomas More, with Melanchthon, with Œcolampadius, all the great humanists, as they were called, interested him enormously. Jung in his library at Küsnacht had a little book which he bought at the age of 19, when he couldn't afford such things, on a barrow in Basel at the university where he was, which was a book by Erasmus in Latin. And one of the last times I saw Jung, he had on a black skull cap, which he wore towards the end, and he was sitting in his study under a portrait of Erasmus, which he always kept there, the famous Holbein portrait of Erasmus. He was sitting there and he was reading this book, and he said, "Please forgive me, I'm getting up," because he said, "I'm just looking for something in Erasmus." And he was reading this Latin. And mind you, he was near his end at the time. He was reading it as I might read a novel, just sort of skipping through it. And he said, "You know, I've got Eddie Bennett staying with me here, and he wants to know where I got the inscription, which is over the door at the entrance to my house. When Jung built his first house, this is what he carved over the door. That's where you came in, at the point where called or not called, God is there." And Jung said, "Of course, I know it comes from the Greeks, but I got it from Erasmus. I'm certain I got it from Erasmus. And I'm going to prove to Bennett that I got it from Erasmus." And he went on until he found the quotation in Erasmus, you see. But this is one of the most moving sort of views I have of him, because there he was close. And when you move into that world of Erasmus, a world of lonely men, because the whole world to civilization to which they belong was breaking up. These lonely men talked to other lonely men. Erasmus wrote to Thomas More, and they corresponded with one another. And that was the only consolation they had. And I remember Jung writing to me not long before he died, saying, "I'm just a lonely old man now, writing for other lonely men."
You know, I'm very interested in the fact that he had important and deep relationship with women.
It's one of the most important things, my dear, in Jung. One must never think about Jung without remembering his love of and for women, his love of the feminine in man, as well as for the feminine in women, and the service he performed for women, and the enormous service which women performed for him. Because I think myself that in a scientific way, completely scientific way, Jung did for the world what Dante did in a poetic way. But whereas Dante was inspired by a beautiful feminine face, the face of Beatrice, face of a girl he just saw in the streets of Florence, and which led him from then on right through his life, Jung had the shattering originality to be inspired by what you might call the ugly face of womankind. Jung had an instinct that what was wrong with life, what made life tear apart, made it incomplete, was because the feminine was rejected. And even in his very, very first book, which he called The Psychology of the Unconscious, I think it's now called Roots of the Unconscious, which led to his break with Freud. Because if there's one thing that Freud didn't have conspicuously in his makeup, it was a sense of the importance of the feminine. I mean, Freud was very much an Old Testament phenomenon. He was a prophet. He was a very great man. I'm not saying this to belittle him, but merely to understand him. He was a very great person, a very great pioneer to whom we owe a lot. But he was an Old Testament phenomenon, and I think more of Jung as a New Testament phenomenon. But Jung had this sense of the rejected feminine enormously. When you go back into his life, and particularly if you go into the case histories which he's left behind in the biography, which I've done, it's very, very interesting to me how most of the cases that really gripped him were the cases of women who had gone, as they called it then, insane. And there was this famous case of this woman, I think her name was Babette, who in the Berkholzli hospital, who'd been there for donkey's years, the one who said, you know, Naples and I, between us, must supply the world with spaghetti. And everybody said, my God, she's crazy. Do you see? She's crazy. What is she talking about? To Jung, it was very significant because he saw in this a law of compensation, that she was trying to put herself into an important role because she was feeling neglected. She'd lost her identity. And he learned an enormous amount from this old lady. And when Freud visited Jung in Zurich for the first time, Jung took Freud to see this old lady. And Freud said to Jung afterwards, yes, I can see that she's an interesting case, but isn't she a hideous old lady? I would hate to spend my time with her. And to Jung, this was quite a shock, he told me. It nearly bowled him over because he'd never thought of her in those terms. That's what I mean, that he could follow, not like Dante, the outward beauty and face of womankind, as most men do, but he could follow the inner face, the averted, the rejected face of women. And so it was not surprising that when he came across the papers and the case of this extraordinary Miss Miller, who had these fantasies, that he could follow her in her fantasies. And that was his first feminine guide, was a deranged feminine spirit, driven insane, driven mad by a world of men, rejected by a masculine-dominated world. Now, Jung worked in this rejected feminine world of the unconscious for years. People came to him. He was particularly successful with women patients. And one person came into his life very early on, because she's already with Jung and Emma Jung at the famous conference in Vienna, where they are all photographed together, and that is Tony Wolff. Now, Tony Wolff, whatever the diagnosis was, it was a very serious diagnosis. A lot of people who knew her said that they despaired of her ever recovering from whatever her psychological disturbance was. I think one must accept that it was profound enough to fit the rare, exceptional spirit that she was, because in a sense, the rarer, the more exceptional the spirit, the deeper the psychological suffering. And Jung managed to bring her out of this, so that by the time of the famous Vienna conference, she was already an integrated, working personality. And to me, that photograph is very moving, because the one who looks young as if she's just been born as Tony Wolfe. She sits there with these large eyes. And she's a person to whom I personally was devoted, not because she worked just with my wife, but she seemed to me to be outstanding in the world of the women around about Jung, and indeed in Zurich. She had a great sense of style. She was an aristocrat of the mind and the spirit. She dressed very well. She entertained very well. She kept a very good table. She had a very good taste in wine. And she was really a person who'd been through the fire and come out whole, an independent spirit. Now, Tony Wolfe's role in Jung's life has always been overlooked, and I think it's one of the great scandals of the Jungian world that they've not ever faced honestly up to what Tony Wolfe's role was, and that they haven't given it decent, honest, and honorable recognition. I've been at them about this for years, and I noticed it, first of all, when I was in Zurich, when I came back from the war. I used to go to some lectures at the Institute, the general ones, when I wasn't writing myself. I used to go down and listen to the general lectures. I wasn't allowed to go to the sort of special ones, you know, where only initiates like my wife could go to. I was not considered to be robust enough psychologically for that sort of thing. And Tony Wolfe was lecturing in the morning on analytical psychology. She was lecturing on the process of individuation, a remarkable series of lectures she gave, coupled with her own concept of feminine psychology. You know, she had her own division of types, which I find very meaningful and very helpful. And she lectured for 2 hours, and then she was immediately followed by Mrs. Jung one day, and the following day Mrs. Jung came first, lecturing on her work on the Holy Grail, and then she was followed by Tony Wolfe. And I noticed a very curious phenomenon, that whenever Mrs. Jung spoke first, there was a beautiful bowl of red roses put on the table for her. And the moment she'd finished, before Tony came in, the roses were removed. When Tony lectured, there were no roses on the table, but the moment she left, the roses were brought in for Mrs. Jung. And I thought, oh, there's a short story in this, you see. This was my first indication of what the feelings were about. But to take it down into the level where it belongs, you see that all the time that Jung was working with the rejected feminine, he was, in a sense, working by projection, to use the term which he coined. And because he was dealing with the feminine through the lives of the rejected feminine in others, an immense charge was building up in himself. And that time when he let himself go, and when he landed deep down in what he came to call the collective unconscious, all this rejected feminine in himself confronted him. And I think this becomes very, very clear in that dream which he tells in Dreams, Memories and Reflections. It's a dream in which Jung again goes down, and he finds somebody whom he thinks is the prophet Elijah sitting there, and there's a great snake, and there's a young girl whom he thinks is Salome, who's blind. And Jung, in Dreams, Memories and Reflections, to my amazement, Jung deals in such detail with all his other dreams. He says, oh, well, he said, you know, the old man, the sage, and the young girl, it's a frequent theme. You find it in Lao Tse, and you find it in myths and legends, and that's all there is about it. Well, that wasn't what all there is about it. I think this is the moment of Jung's greatest psychological peril. He's confronted with the fact that, like the whole of mankind, he himself, that his anima, his soul, in this aspect is blind. And then if you think of the associations with Salome, because they must be the same for all of us. She was the daughter of a Roman proconsul, and she demanded the head of John the Baptist, who was the forerunner of Christ, on a platter, and she got it. And something is demanding Jung's head on a platter inside him, and it's this blind anima, this blind feminine soul of himself. And what does he do? We don't hear anything more about dreams on the subject. I'm certain he had plenty. We don't hear any talk about the anima, and we know the importance that Jung attached to the anima. We hear nothing more about it. There's a sort of reference about an anima figure, about a sophisticated lady who tries to persuade him that he's an artist, really, and not a scientist, and he rightly rejects that voice. What happens in this period? This is the time when Tony Wolff took over. This is the time. Tony Wolff was not blind. She'd been in this world before. She was the only one who knew it. And she took over from Salome. And she conducted, in this unfamiliar, terrifying underground of the collective unconscious, she was Jung's guide, to such an extent that she lived with him. And she took over the whole of the burden. And of course the tensions caused by that in Zurich and in the family must have been tremendous. But it was done quite openly, lived out quite openly, and I don't think that if it had not been for Tony Wolff, that Jung really could have survived and could have done the work on the collective unconscious in the manner that he did it, that we all owe it. This is a debt that we owe Tony Wolff, and the only way to repay it to somebody who's dead is to talk about it and to give it decent recognition. And in a sense, that's what women have had to do throughout history. In a sense, they've had to train their own men, as it were, to become responsible for their own feminine selves, and to see not only the external, but the inner side of women. And Jung himself had the greatness to prepare the reflection of himself, because that was what Tony Wolff was, and what these rejected women were, to train himself for this moment so that he would have an instrument at his side to complete the work which men and women have to do between them on earth. And I think that's very, very, that to me is one of the most important accomplishments of Jung, which led to this discovery then of the masculine in the feminine, of the animus and the anima, and that for the first time on earth now, instead of men being just a twosome or being a threesome, we're a foursome. We're so much stronger. The square is there. The masculine within the feminine and the feminine within the man. There are four. And therefore I think it makes the relationships between men and women much more difficult because they're more complex, but also makes them more meaningful and the potential infinitely greater. And to me, perhaps one of the most moving things of all is that Mrs. Jung, Emma Jung, said to a close friend of mine just before she died that she had never ceased to be grateful in her life for Tony Wolff, because Tony Wolff was able to do for her husband something that she could not have done. And I think not acknowledging this has done an enormous harm to the humanity, the fallible humanity, which is very important if one wants to realize how perishable and imperishable the human being is, the paradox of human nature. This is very important that this should be known. But also, not knowing the proper story, people get trapped into literal imitations of Jung's life. They feel that, you know, unless they do something similar, they can't arrive where he arrived at. But it was all done absolutely openly. And I think we can't honor this particular relationship enough. And what is so marvelous about Tony is that there came a moment, really, when she had fulfilled her role in Jung's life. In a sense that he had to move on. Jung always said, I'm a man, you know, it's awful that I had this terrible task to perform on behalf of life, that I could not follow up my human relationships. I had to press on. He said to me, I'm a man in battle. He said, I can't stop to nurse the wounds of people who fell to the ground beside me. I had to go on with the battle. And in a sense, he had to leave Tony Wolff, as it were, on the side. I mean, she kept on seeing him to the end of her life. It was a bitter blow to him when she died. But she was ready, in a sense, to use an awful trade union word, she suddenly became redundant. And then somehow she had the integrity to make a life of her own and to make a contribution to psychology, particularly to the understanding of for a man, of the psychology of women, which she couldn't have made in any other way. And all these things have been swept under the mat, and it's time that they were brought out and looked at honorably.
Well, I'm grateful to you for telling us about it. You had mentioned that you were aware of Jung's effect on some of the simple people that lived in Bolingen.
I remember on one occasion when I was staying with Jung, when Ruth Bailey was looking after him, a young extrovert hunter from Kenya arrived at the place to look up Ruth. And he was a very simple, straightforward young man who took people out to shoot lion and rhinoceros and elephant and things like that. And I don't think he'd read a book in his life, perhaps. And be very, his happiest moment, I'm certain, was when he could escape from school and leave it finally behind him. And Ruth said to me that I think it was a good idea that she took him up to see Jung, who was working upstairs. But I said, of course, because he'd love to talk Africa to anybody. He loved Africa. Africa was one of the great experiences of his life. It was, and in fact, it was the final external experience of his life. After Africa, the external world really stopped interesting him. And so this young man went up, you see, saying to me, I wonder, what the hell do you talk to the old boy about? He said to me. Well, anyway, he went up. He was gone for about an hour and a half. And then he came down, his eyes were shining, and he said to me, my God, he said, I'm very glad, he said, I've met one old man who's not a phony. Well, there you have an example, you see, of the sort of effect he had. And then the simple people adored him around about Küsnacht. They all thought, Jung said to me, they all think I'm a witch doctor. And they want me to do witchcraft on their behalf. And I said to him, why don't you come back to Africa with me? He said, you know, when I came back from Mount Elgon and from Kenya, and living amongst the witch doctors of Africa, he said, I found so much witchcraft in Switzerland. I felt that I had to deal with all this witchcraft first before I could, before I could travel again. And he used to refer to himself as an old witch doctor. And very often when people asked him, saying, you know, are you a Protestant? Are you a Catholic? He said, you mustn't ask me these questions. He did write somewhere, I'm a Protestant, but a Protestant of the extreme left, I think, he said. He would say, oh, no, don't ask me these questions. He said, you know, I'm only an old African who finds his God in his dreams. And he really meant that. because that is in the dream world ultimately, through which he saw the past becoming immediate and the future being born. It was the place where time and eternity met, and where he himself was timeless. And it was one of his great achievements that he restored the dream to human beings as the Word of God, which, if properly read in a four-dimensional way, will show us where next to go when thinking fails, when feeling fails, when everything else fails. There you turn. That's where you have to turn to know the way. That's the compass. That's where the radar is. It's like Jacob's ladder. And it's bringing that back in a contemporary way. And this, to me, is really the importance of Jung. Is again, we're back in this area where man inside himself stands as a transgressor, facing his own reflection in the mirror of God that Jung called the self. This is the great message. This is the great achievement. There's no escape. There's no good thinking there's a magic answer that you could do, exhort people as the priests are exhorting them. This was to Jung, was, I think, where one felt a real sense of tragedy, a sense of tragedy about Jung, was the fact that he was trying to do so much for religion, and that the churches and the priests wouldn't recognize it. It was an immense shock to him when Victor White went sour on him and turned, put a knife into him so cruelly when he wrote his answer to Job, which was really the only time that Jung really bared his heart to mankind, was in that book, Answer to Job, when he really had a dialogue with God and said, come on, God, what is all this about? Let's have it out, man to man, almost, as it were, you see. And instead of people seeing that this was really giving the book of Job its contemporary meaning, they turned on him, you see. And he simply couldn't understand it. He was always saying, why don't the priests go down with me into the collective, into the unconscious of modern man, to learn what the modern soul is about before they start to cure it? Because nobody would look at the soul of man in the modern way. They all behaved, as I said before, as if creation was accomplished, if the soul was an accomplished fact. And it wasn't. That's why the book of Revelations had so much meaning to Jung. And that's why he saw it having its place in the Bible. Calvin fought very desperately to have the book of Revelation removed from the Bible, because he called it a dark and dangerously obscure book. But it really is very meaningful, because it's the one book which suggests that the revelation of God doesn't end with the coming of Christ. There is more to come. That religion is a process of continuing revelation and experiencing of revelation, and being obedient to your greater awareness of becoming in life. But he tried very hard. He wrote to William Temple, who was one of the greatest archbishops we had in this country, and said to me, please send one of your men to me to come and work with me. We never got an answer. They just didn't come. And a few who did come seemed to come only so that they could learn just enough of psychology to put their particular special plea all the more convincingly. They didn't come for the sake of the revelation. You don't go into the unconscious in order to work better at the conveyor belt in some motor car factory or at some machine. You have to do the journey for its own sake, not knowing what's going to come out of it at the other end, whether there's a reward or not. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Jungian psychology, in a way, isn't what the world calls more successful than other forms of psychology. Why other people are always looking for easier ways, even in a sense of The Freudian approach is easier because it's got definite rules laid down. And there are other forms of psychology you know of far better than I that are even easier.
Mm-hmm. There's a kind of a definition of the goal already in hand.
Yes, but Jung puts the burden squarely on each person. And this psychology of individuation, of making what you are and what you've inherited of the universe, of making that specific, of making what you've got of the collective in you, making that individual, and carrying it as an individual, and not only standing still in it, but allowing an act of becoming in the midst of your being to become your own way of moving through life. This is the hardest thing you can ask of human beings. And of course this makes it not very popular. It's already transforming people's view of history. It certainly, that's where it makes immense sense to me, because history has always been frightfully important to me. And honestly, it's the only thing that really makes history an understandable process, as to because a history which consists of learning the time when the king was born, and when a king was crowned, and when he died, and when a war began and a peace was made, and all this kind of nonsense, that never made any sense to me at all. These are purely the manifest level, but this volcanic striving which erupts in these surface events, which we see on the surface, it's Jung's psychology, only one. I don't know how a historian can write history without Jung. I don't know how an art critic, for instance, a theatre critic, can be a proper critic if he doesn't know something about the theory of type. Because all round one sees one person condemning another person just because there's a different psychological type. No other reason. Completely non-rational reasons. And I'm not saying now that Jung's is the ultimate answer. But my God, he's given us enough to go on with for a while. And working from that basis, I'm certain more and more people will advance onwards into the future. And there's an enormous amount of recognition still to come.
You had been speaking of how Jung's work might inform history, the understanding of history, and political life itself. Could you go on with that?
Jung always admired the system in Great Britain so much, the two-party system, which you have in Great Britain, and which you have in the United States as well, depends on what appear ostensibly are rational grounds. They pretend to have different policies, but actually they are produced by two kinds of types, the two types of human beings that you find, the extroverts and the introverts. The one is an outward moving, dynamic kind of person going out towards the world, or wants to change and move on. The other's more conservative, turning inward and trying to contain that which is already there. This is that they are rooted, and that's why they worked so well, because between them they made a whole. As we've seen, the collectivist pattern taking over all over society. The paradox is you get a form of totalitarianism which is producing collectivism, then you get a kind of creation of greater and greater monopolies of commerce, bigger and bigger business, producing a kind of organization man, which is the equivalent of the totalitarian organization man, where this individual thing disappears. And really, this kind of this kind of politics of individuation, which you might call democracy, ceases to exist. And this is the point where we've reached at the moment. And at this point, all that's inferior, which Jung used to call the shadow, in man tends to come to the surface. And you know how the shadow works. It works, you project it on your neighbor. You project it onto other nations. The thing you dislike most in yourself becomes, you're usually unconscious of it, becomes manifest in what you dislike in your neighbors. And instead of dealing with it through yourself, you deal with it through the lives of other peoples. And this is such a shattering phenomenon of our time. Now, everybody's dealing with everybody else's problems and not with their own. And this is why we're in the mess that we're in the world. And it's this, because we have, through modern science and technology, we've got such immense power that it is so dangerous. Because unless we get a sense of moral responsibility, a sense of spiritual responsibility corresponding to that power, we're in very, very great danger. And that's why Jung kept on saying towards the end of his life, the greatest danger to life at the moment is man and the ignorance of man. Man is woefully ignorant about his own nature. The psychology of individuation has nothing to do with politics at all, because it deals with the ultimate values. But yes, it has shattering political implications. And the kind of society, the kind of politics that will save us will have to be where more important than any other quality in our politicians, must demand psychological illumination, psychological awareness, because otherwise we get people sparring with their own shadows. Otherwise you get nations, as we had in 1939, like the Germans, projecting their shadows onto the Jews, and then when they were eliminating the Jews, onto the Poles and God knows what not else, you see. And Jung often said to me, he said, the human being who starts by withdrawing his own shadow from his neighbor is doing work of immense, immediate political and social importance. And not only political and social importance, but of universal importance. Because there is the thing that Jung was concerned with, which is the cosmic shadow. Because there's a shadow cast by creation itself, of which we each carry a portion, and which lends dignity to our shadow. And it brings me to almost the last thing that Jung said to me. Think of everything he did, of everything he stands for, leading up to what he says in this letter to me. Jung wrote, I cannot define for you what God is. I cannot tell you even that God is. But what I can say is that all my work has scientifically proved that the pattern of God exists in every man, and that this pattern has at its disposal the greatest transforming energies of which mankind is capable.